Okay, time to get going. As you can see, this is the new updated official US government map. It's not mine. And it's not the rest of the world. And I'm sure it'll go back to the Gulf of Mexico, which got its name a long, long time ago. Quite funny. Doesn't include Canada yet. And the Panama Canal zone is way off, somewhere down there. It does include California, although the Danes are trying to buy it, as I suggested to you last week. And they've renamed it New Denmark. So politics of maps is quite fascinating. So who knows how long this map will be what it is. Now this lecture, I said I was going to talk to you about the role of religion in the United States. They're constantly stressing this motto, "In God we trust." It's on everything sort of official. Trump keeps invoking the name of God, but when they asked him what his favourite Bible passage was, he didn't have one. And it's well known that he doesn't read books. But the fact is that religion is an incredibly powerful factor in US history, and is a very, very powerful force today. And so I thought it was important, talking about the creation of the United States, to talk about the different religious groups who have come there, mainly from Europe, starting with the Pilgrim Fathers, the Puritans, and then these constant waves of evangelical revivals, and then the current forces of religion. So this is just the sort of general map. So if we go back right to the beginning of the 13 colonies, just as we talk about the first fleet in the US, they talk about the Pilgrim Fathers, who landed, of course, in what was Massachusetts. And the first thing they did when they got there was they had a prayer meeting, and then proceeded to massacre the Native Americans. That was the contrast, I think, with the Quakers, I'll talk about in a minute, in Pennsylvania. What I wanted to stress was this Puritans, it's not a denomination, it was a general term that was sort of applied in Britain. So I'll sort of go back and look at the origin of it and who were they and what were their faiths. So in Britain, you had the Catholic Church until the Protestant Reformation, and then pretty much established under Elizabeth, after Henry VIII and his problem with his wives. And the difference was, of course, that on the mainland of Europe, you had the splits, you had the Lutherans, and the Lutherans are quite a strong force today in the United States. They split. Every good church has splits. Quakers have numerous splits, believe it or not. The thing with the Lutherans, and it's going to come through with all of the different faiths that I talk about, is a complete polarization between what I would call the progressive forces and the conservative forces. I want to really stress that. So the Lutherans very strong with not so much the Germans as Scandinavians. If you want to know, or if you want to go into all the different splits, you can. I'm not going to sort of detail them all here. But the other breakaway in Europe, of course, the two other main forces of the Protestant Reformation, there were the independent churches that looked at Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, and then manifested themselves in Britain with the three independent churches, the Congregationalists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians. And I think I told you last week that if you look up what religion President Trump belongs to, he's still officially a Presbyterian. It may be because his mum came from the Outer Hebrides when she was 17. She would have been a wee free from the Presbyterians, but I'm not going to go into all their splits. We had them here. It's quite fascinating. They were essentially the base of the Pilgrim Fathers, those three we use the term nonconformists for the sort of the non-Anglican Protestants. And they also drew a lot from the Netherlands. And in fact, the Pilgrim Fathers originally were people who emigrated from the east of England to the Netherlands and then sort of came back and then continued on to the United States. The other group I wanted to refer to, because people often ask about it, the Radical Reformation. And that's where the Mennonites come in, and the group that people are always asking about, the Amish. What happened there was, as soon as the Bible was translated, thanks to Luther and so, people started to read, some people who could read started to read it, and they found Jesus preaching some pretty radical stuff. And that was the basis of the group that became the Anabaptists. And they, obviously the name comes from the fact they practiced adult baptism. There's nothing about baby baptism or christening in the New Testament. That kicked in later. And there were a number of different groups. The Mennonites got their name from a Dutch pastor, Menno Simons. And they, of course, were heavily persecuted. Many of them moved around. And of course, as soon as Quakers set up Pennsylvania and tolerated them, they're one of the three historic peace churches, the Mennonites moved there. But the Mennonites split, like, as I said, my Mennonite friends when I lived in the States said to me, we have over 30 different splits in the Mennonites. I said, well, that's more than the Quakers. And the Amish are just one of those. And they settled in Pennsylvania because the Quakers were tolerant. It was an obvious place for them to settle. And just to the west of Philadelphia, you've got Lancaster County, and that's the place where you often see pictures of the Amish in their buggies. They're sometimes mistakenly called the Pennsylvania Dutch. It's actually Deutsch, and they still speak an old 18th century form of German. And they still stick to their radical ideas. People sort of go and look at them as a curiosity. They don't have a political force. They're not a political force in the United States, but they are good organic farmers, and the soil in Lancaster County is the richest in the United States. The problem then is they have rather a lot of children, and so when they're sort of running out of land to farm it out to their kids, they've resettled. So there's quite a few Mennonite settlements in different places in South America, and quite a few of them still you find in Europe. So I just thought I'd throw them in because they are interesting, because people want to know who the Amish are. So they're one of the branches of the Mennonite Church. Another group that you will come across, another part of the Mennonites, actually in Canada, in Lower Canada, you can see where Toronto is, that was originally called Lower Canada. That's where Governor Arthur went after he left here. And they're known as the Hutterites. And they've got a Conrad Grable College in Ontario, University of Waterloo, is where I spent some time and met with them there when I was there. So they're a fascinating group, but not a political force in the United States. The group that I did want to refer to were the group who turned to John Calvin in Geneva. Calvin was French, got kicked out of France, of course, so he went to Geneva and set up a theocracy. That theocracy is where you've got head of the church is also head of the state. And a lot of people from Britain and other parts of Europe went and sat at the feet of Calvin. He preached the doctrine of predestination. This is quite important to understand in the United States, because Calvinist theology is really central to a lot of the powerful religious groups in the United States today, especially the Pentecostals. He was a very conservative form of faith. He had problems with women. Obviously, he relied on St. Paul a lot, which has caused a lot of problems. And the Pilgrim Fathers were very heavily influenced by Calvinist theology. So it's not a denomination. You will hear it used occasionally when people talk about Calvinistic Methodists, but Methodists were much later. They were much more in the 18th century, so we're not concerned about them at this point. So the Pilgrim Fathers were Puritans. Again, it's not a Puritan church, but their theology very much came from Calvinism. And it's still very central in the United States. It goes along with the God helps those who help themselves, which is a very powerful force in the United States in terms of the economy and society. This is where it goes back to. So right from the start, when you had religious refugees coming from Europe, a lot of them who were being persecuted in Europe, because the Anglicans didn't like them and nor did the Catholics, they brought their Calvinist theology with them. And that's very central to Calvinism. Issues with women, promotion of capitalism, God helps those who help themselves, and socially very, very conservative. So it's quite important to understand Calvinist theology. The Catholics were having a hard time in Britain, and that's where Maryland kicks in. Here it is. So here you've got Maryland here. Lord Baltimore, that's where Baltimore gets its name from. He set Maryland up as they were initially private estates, the colonies, especially for Catholics. And that's why a lot of them went there and where they got the name Maryland from. But I want to explain, although Catholics are still not a large percentage in the United States, and don't forget, it took a long time before they elected a Catholic as president. That was the significance of John F. Kennedy, first Catholic to be elected. Again, very different branches of the Catholic Church. They're very conservative force, socially. But I also wanted to stress there's a very strong radical Catholic tradition in the United States, and I spent quite a lot of time with them. Some of you may have heard of Dorothy Day. I still get the paper. It still costs 1 cent. The postage costs a lot more than the paper. So this is the Catholic Worker. It's been coming out seasonally since the 1930s. I really enjoy reading it. They're very central at the moment in the United States because they've been resisting Trump's moves to deport people he doesn't like. And they pioneered the idea of the churches as a sanctuary. So many of them have turned over their churches to people who are fearful of being deported. Trump has said he's not going to take any notice of sanctuary. Interesting. So the other thing that you'll find when you go to the United States, I know a lot of you have been there, awful lot of homeless people. But one of the things the Catholic Worker Movement has set up around the United States are houses of hospitality. There are a number of them in the big cities. I often stayed with them. They provide soup. They have a farm in New England. And politically they're quite active, but very insignificant in terms of having any impact in the United States. I just wanted to stress that the role of Catholics in the United States, yes, they are often seen as very conservative. Some of you may remember Cardinal Spellman during the American War in Vietnam, very conservative supporter of intervention in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. But I want to stress there is also this radical Catholic tradition in the United States, and we must never forget that. It's important to keep in touch with them. One of the places where I was most impressed with them was when I was in Los Angeles, and I went and stayed down in the slums of Los Angeles with the Catholic Worker House. Doctors there, radical doctors, not necessarily Catholics, give 1 day a week to go and give free treatment to the people who live on the streets. Okay, we don't hear about it, but I wanted to tell you about it because I think it's important to realise how diverse the Catholic Church is, particularly today, where they're confronting the Trump administration. So a lot of good work going on, again, both sides. Okay, so we move on from the 17th century, and then, as I said to you, later on, 17th, 18th century, more waves of refugees, often religious refugees coming. Some of course, some religious refugees came here. I mean, that's why the Germans came to South Australia in the early 19th century. The groups I really wanted to focus on are the 19th century. What you've got in the history of the United States, and here to a certain extent, are what they call these waves of evangelical revivalism. We often sort of see it in terms of, originally it used to be big meetings, when you get preachers who had a gift of the gab, basically, people like Billy Graham, and attracted thousands. And this tradition, of course, goes back to the wagon trails that were sort of moving across the United States, and people would sort of meet together for open-air services. And the tradition in Protestantism is very much the word. So people really like a good preacher. And hymn singing, which was really introduced by the Wesley brothers. So again, that's a very powerful force. And that, of course, applies very much to Afro-Americans, who put a lot of emphasis on singing. I'll come to that a bit later, and the importance of music in their religion. The 19th century, which is where I really want to sort of move on to, they call this the Second Great Awakening period. So let's have a look at some of the groups that we often hear about, most of which seem to have been started in the United States. When the door knockers come around, and there are two basic groups, I'll tell you about them, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. The Mormons don't like being called Mormons. They're officially now known as the Latter-day Saints. But I'll use the term Mormons, I hope you don't mind. It's just easier. They put a lot of emphasis on missionary outreach. The problem there, of course, is they believe they're the only ones who are going to go there. And the rest of us are sinners. And this goes back again to Calvinism, the idea of predestination, that God has chosen those of us who will be saved. And you're saved through hard work, and God rewards you. God helps those who help themselves, as I said. And that's very, very central to Calvinist theology. God is rewarding you for your hard work. So let's have a look at some of these interesting groups that came up. When the Jehovah's Witnesses come around, I can't help it. I answer the door, and I love to talk to them. And they always grab a Bible. They've got their own Bible. It's an official Jehovah's Witness Bible. And they say, it says here in Mark chapter 14, verse 6 or whatever. And then they ask me what I think, and I say, yes, who was Mark? So we have an interesting discussion, and they say, well, I don't know, it's in the Bible. I said, well, we don't know who Mark. Oh, so on it goes. Eventually they give up on me. But I find it quite fascinating to talk to them. I used to invite them to come and talk to my class at school. It's important, and of course they stand out in the centre in Franklin Square, going up, waiting for people to come and talk to them. So who are they? It was started by a guy called Charles Russell in Pennsylvania in 1870. He originally founded what they called it the Watchtower Society. Why are they called Jehovah's Witnesses? They go back to the Old Testament, where God is Jehovah or Yahweh. So a lot of their ideas are literally bits they've taken out of the Bible, which are very central to their faith. Part of it is, of course, they're well known for that. They won't have blood transfusions. They get themselves into trouble over that. That's an obscure passage in Pauline epistles. I'm not going to go into religion and blood, but religion and blood is fairly central to a number of religions, whether or not you can transfer blood, have blood, get blood, or whatever. That's probably what they're best known for. They don't celebrate Christmas or Easter, or birthdays, actually. But they're not the only ones. Even the early Quakers didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter. They still don't. They do. The other passage they take is, I don't know how many of you read the book of Revelation. I love discussing Revelation with them. Revelation got in the Bible by mistake. when the early church fathers were deciding what books went into the Bible and what didn't, this was back in the 5th century, they thought Revelation was written by John the disciple. And it wasn't. It was another John, John of Patmos, who was exiled on an island in the Mediterranean in the early 90s, not our 90s, their 90s. At the time, they were expecting a great persecution. And the important thing with Hebrew is that letters have numbers attached to them. So the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book, that's why it's full of predictions of the end time, this is where you get this idea of the 12 times 12 times 1,000, the 144,000 that Jehovah's Witnesses say will be saved. That's where it comes from. But it should never have been in the Bible. As I said, they just made a mistake with which John it was. Lots of people called John. John just means blessed of the Lord. The name Jones is Welsh for son of John, Abshon. So they're quite a conservative force, but they don't let you vote. I'm not sure what happens in Australia. I don't know if they get fined or if they're exempt. But officially they don't vote. So they're not a political force in the United States. Another interesting group that was developed in the United States, and I often talk, when they come and talk to me, I often say, why has God always talked to white men in the United States? Always puzzles me that. So another guy, Seventh-day Adventists, fascinating group. Why do they get that name? They started in the 1840s, going during this period. They called the Great Awakening. They said, well, in the Bible it says you go to the centre of worship on a Saturday. Well, of course it does. The Jews worship from sunset Friday through to sunset on Saturday. And that's why they're called Seventh Day, okay? And why they worship on a Saturday. They got themselves into problems with that because they are very strict in terms of diet. They're very strict vegetarians. Very strict ones. They won't even drink tea or coffee, and certainly not alcohol. They make very good studies for cancer because they don't get bowel cancer and things like that, whether we get from eating, or some people get from eating too much meat or processed food. And so they invented sanitarium and Kellogg's cornflakes, so that we had good, healthy breakfasts. So all of this sort of came out of the groups in the United States. They have missionaries. They're very strong in the South Pacific. And they're called Adventists. And this is where we come to another factor that's important in religion in the United States. Jesus is coming back. I'm always fascinated by this, and I always, again, this is, I suppose, why they don't end up talking to me for too long. When they start talking about that, I say, look, people have been expecting Jesus to come back for 2,000 years. Paul and the early disciples expected Jesus to return in their lifetime. Jehovah's Witnesses are famous because they use the book of Revelation and the number stuff to work out exactly when Jesus is coming back, and then he doesn't come back, and they say, oh, well, we'll have to recalculate it. And that is it's a very common theme in the United States today, not just the Jehovah's Witnesses. Jesus is coming back in our lifetime. And it's tied up with this theological idea that you are saved, everyone else isn't, but the world's a messy place, well, we know that. And so God is going to intervene, and they have, again, this obscure passage in the New Testament, the rapture. And when I was in South Africa hitchhiking, I got picked up by a group of Afrikaners who said, would you like to come and watch a film about the end of the world with us? Yes, I said, I'd be fascinated. And it literally was the rapture. And what happened was that there were all sort of people were running around and riding around, and suddenly, boom, all the good people got sucked up, including a couple on a motorbike, which I was very impressed with. And people like me got left behind. But it's serious. I mean, this is this feeling. It's so important in the United States, in the politics as well. We are the chosen people. It goes back to the Puritans and the Pilgrim Fathers. that this is the promised land. And again, it goes back to the idea of Moses in the Old Testament. God is leading his chosen people to the promised land. And they saw the United States as the promised land. And it's still very central to a lot of the theology in the United States. So again, you've got to go back to look at the Bible and look at these different groups to see where this idea comes from. And so they're known as the Seventh-day Adventists. Jesus is coming. They don't make the mistake of the Jehovah's Witnesses by calculating the date. But a lot of them say he's coming in our time. And it's no good saying, look, they've been expecting that for 2,000 years. Why are you right and all the others wrong? Oh, because we're right. And Jesus is coming back because the rest of us have mucked up the world. So Jesus is going to come and clean it up and reward all the good people. That's the basic thinking. It's amazing how strong that feeling is in the United States, particularly in the Midwest. So they've written off the rest of the world. Some of you may have come across that series of books that came out a few years ago. They made a lot of films about it. They again go back to the book of Revelation and the idea of the 1,000 years and the Antichrist. So, book of Revelation again. And the book is fascinating. Who is the Antichrist? The Secretary General of the United Nations. Seriously. This is important to explain the hatred so many Americans have got of the United Nations. There are big posters around the United States. Get out of the United Nations. And again, it's come to the fore again with the current regime. So again, it goes back to this religious concept that the Antichrist is coming. It was the Secretary General of the United Nations in this series. The Antichrist comes and everybody falls for the Antichrist. And then it turns out to be Satan come back. And then Jesus intervenes and the good guys win at the end of the 1,000 years. Again, the book of Revelation is very serious, the centrality of the Bible. And it takes people like John Shelby Spong, I'm a great fan of his, Anglican bishop, again, the radical fringe, with his biblical scholarship to understand where these books, where these ideas come from. But doesn't make any headway with conservative religious groups like this. Let's have a look at a few of the others who are very powerful in the United States today. Christian Scientists. I'm fascinated by that. I said to you, I used to ask people, why does God always speak to white male Americans? Not all. The Christian Science Church, 1879, again this period, a woman, Mary Baker Eddy, started in Boston in Massachusetts, which is where the Christian Science Monitor is published. Christadelphians, they've got a church here in Hobart, started by John Thomas, middle of the 19th century. Then the two other groups that I need to mention here because they're quite important, and again we've got the offshoots here. The Brethren. Now this one is very confusing. There are so many different churches who call themselves the Brethren. You are brothers in Christ. I don't know where the women fit in, but the group that we hear most about are the Plymouth Brethren. And again, they take the name from Plymouth in England, although they actually started in Ireland, and came over, and they have split and split and split again. I won't bore you with tales of my upbringing, but we had brethren in my family. Grandma got kicked out. The group that we hear most about, and they're very important in the United States and here, because although they don't let their members vote, they fund right-wing political parties. And again, very strong conservative theology, particularly when it comes to gender issues and whether or not you're straight or gay. Now, you're sort of wondering why Trump is pounding away on this issue of gender identity. A lot of it goes back to these groups, central to their theology. Just a sort of slight diversion, I always sort of, if they start talking about that, I say, where does it say that in the Bible? And they say, well, it says it in the Pentateuch, the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I say, yeah, that's the Jewish text. And Orthodox Jews still believe that, that's okay. a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. Okay, but that's Judaism 4,000 years ago. And then they say, Paul said it. It's text in Corinthians. I said, no, it isn't. Go and show it to me. The text you're looking at is the bit where Paul is ranting against temple prostitution, which was a big problem and affected men and women. It doesn't say anything specific about being gay. So it's fascinating. It doesn't get you anywhere, but it's interesting to be able to debate with them why they're so focused on this. And we're seeing it now in the United States. And here there are certain groups, I don't need to name them, who are rattling on about gender identity. Every day I open the Mercury, there's half a black and yellow page about it. The group that we most hear about are the exclusive brethren. I told you they split again. They're an interesting group. They split back in 1848. Although their last leader was American, he got sacked for being an alcoholic. The current leader is in Sydney. And here we come back to this issue, and I'm going to move on next to the Mormons. Why are they so wealthy? Again, they get this passage from the Bible, tithing. You give 1/10 of your income to the church. And this is why some of them are extremely wealthy. And the exclusive brethren, whose leader is an accountant at the moment in Sydney, and we've got them here in Hobart, in Tasmania, particularly in the north, gain this incredibly conservative attitude towards women. They take this passage. I told you Paul has so much to answer for. It says, a woman shall not minister to men. And so they take that literally. And so the men, impeccably dressed, they don't have beards, because again, God and hair is another interesting topic. It's not just Christianity. Hair is a big thing in a lot of religions. Either excess hair or no hair. They spend, I think they've got a school here. Until recently, they wouldn't let their students use computers. They have a problem because they won't let their students go to university. We all know universities are a hotbed of corruption. I wish. They might get the wrong ideas, basically. Then their problem is they can't be teachers. So the schools are interesting. They employ non-brethren teachers, but very, very strict about what they're allowed to teach the students. The girls also have to have long hair, which comes down to about here. They must wear skirts and not allowed to wear pants. I don't quite know where it says that in the New Testament. And they have to come down below their knees. So you'll always recognize them. Beautifully long hair, beautiful long skirts. But their whole job is to minister and look after men. So their meetings, church prayer meetings, singing, they have their halls. The women basically wait on the men. This text in the New Testament of Paul, well, it's in the book of Timothy actually, that a woman shall not minister to men. So again, can you sort of see the power of where texts are sort of selected and then become central to all these different denominations? But what they've all got in common is this incredibly conservative theology. And it's coming out now with the current regime. It's quite fascinating. So let's have a look at the Mormons, because we hear so much about that. And again, it was a bit like Kennedy being the first Catholic. They still haven't had a Mormon president, although there was a Mormon candidate. So who are they? We hear so much about them. They again came out of what we call the Second Great Awakening period. Joseph Smith, back in the 1820s, he was in upstate New York, a place called the Hill of the Vision. And he was confused, all the different religions kicking around with people that then coming over from Europe as religious refugees. And so he had a vision, and an angel called Moroni sort of turned up and showed him the plates of gold. This was in 1823. And they were the text. I was looking for my copy of the Book of Mormon. I couldn't find it. I found it in a second-hand bookshop. it came out in 1830, and basically it's a third book of the Bible. So there's a lot of debate, are Mormons Christians or not? And their belief is that after Jesus ascended, and I always find that a fascinating idea, because back then people believed the earth was, the firmament was finite. So if Jesus ascended into heaven and sitteth at the right hand of God the Father, well, it was a place. Well, now we know it isn't. So presumably it's still ascending. They say Jesus came down in the United States. So he founded, that's why it's called the Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints. And that's the name they like. And so if you see signs to the churches here in Hobart, there's one in Glenorchy, one on the other side of the river, it's shortened because it's so long to say Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints. And they officially have said, please don't call us Mormons, we call ourselves the Latter-day Saints. And again, very conservative and the wealthiest church in the United States. They give 1/10 of their income to the church, who invest it. It's extremely wealthy as a result. So although the current membership in the United States is about 7 million, it's important to look at the numbers, and there's just as many scattered in other parts of the world because of their door knocking. And it's one of the rules, and I've often talked to their missionaries because I'm really curious about it. So you've got teenage boys, they insist that girls can do it as well, but I've never met any. They spend their whole teenage years saving up for their 2 years missionary service. It's impressive. And they're, again, a very clean life. They certainly don't like straight or gay. They get married very young. They do this 2 years missionary service, and they could be sent anywhere in the world. I was once in the South Pacific, and I talked to a Maori guy, because they're very popular with the Maoris in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I said, where did they send you? He said, to a Native American reservation in the United States. I said, did you convert anyone? He said, no. So, well, still got guts. He went 2 years and still that was his thing, and he didn't make any progress, but that's what they do. So 6 days a week, they go around door knocking, and then one day they sit down and evaluate. You'll always recognize them, beautifully dressed, suits and ties, short hair, again this God and the hair thing, and it's part of their faith. What happened, because an interesting story, they were chased out of New England because they looked at the Bible and said, you can have lots of wives. Well, it's true. I think Abraham had hundreds of them, so did some of the other early prophets. Don't go into those stories. So they said, we can have as many wives as we like. Well, that wasn't very popular in the United States in the 19th century, so they chased them out, and they went to Ohio. You can see Ohio and Illinois, that's where Chicago is, and Missouri, a bit further across. They were just chased all the way, and their founder, Joseph Smith, finally got killed by a lynch mob in 1844. And the guy who took over, a guy called Brigham Young, and he said, okay, we've got to go. And they set off on the great trek across the United States, and they crossed the Rockies, and stood on the top of the Rockies. I went up there and had a look. There's a big statue there of Brigham Young looking down at the state of Utah. This is the place. That's what the statue is called. So I went and had a look at that. And it founded Salt Lake City in 1847. And that's why Utah is known as the Mormon state. Well, they still got themselves into trouble because of their practice of having rather too many wives. And eventually, the church in Salt Lake City, that's where the centrality is, they said, okay, if we're going to be part of the United States, we'll have to accept just one wife. And Utah was admitted to the United States in 1896, when they finally said one wife. But there's a whole lot of naughty Mormons who scattered out in the desert, and also in places like Arizona, where they still practice polygamy and get themselves into fearful trouble. But they still practice it. They're wealthy, as I said, because they give up 10% of their income to the church. The other group I wanted to talk about, because they're very powerful in the United States today, are the Pentecostals. Now, in the late 19th century, and here too, of course, were the strong, they, in the late 19th century, when Darwin and the idea of evolution came along, a lot of Christians were really upset by this. What? Bible's wrong? You know, and they started asking questions about things like the virgin birth and Noah's Ark and all sorts of ideas in the Bible. Biblical scholarship. Germans started biblical scholarship. Fascinating, another story. They said you can't question all of this. We believe in the fundamentals. That's where we get the word fundamentalist from. And why are they called Pentecostals? And there are a number of different ones. The main Pentecostal church is the Assemblies of God. And again, started in the United States. And then spread. Quite powerful. Why Pentecost? It's that passage in the Acts of the Apostles, after Jesus, well, wherever he went, the disciples are meeting and the Holy Spirit descends upon them and they all start talking in tongues. And everybody understands them. And that's why central to Pentecostalism is speaking in tongues. And the other thing that's central to Pentecostalism is the laying on of hands for healing. And so at their meetings, people will come forward to be healed. And we keep seeing this popping up. There's been that nasty court case in Queensland recently with people saying, well, Jesus will heal, we'll just lay hands. In this case, the poor little girl died. And so that's central to Pentecostalism. But it's not a church. There's a number of different denominations. It's a theology. And the Assemblies of God is the one that's best known. Okay, it started in California in the early 20th century. But very strong in the United States, incredibly strong. Basically because their services are popular, particularly with young people and young families. A lot of singing, dancing, praising the Lord. But a big turnover. And very, very conservative theologically. So it's a lot of these different groups. If you go to particularly the Midwest, where people still will go to church on Sunday, different churches, Methodist, Baptist, Pentecostal, it's not one particular church, but what they've all got in common is this very conservative theology. It's basically Calvinist, that we are the chosen. And the other group I wanted to refer to, Afro-Americans. And that's fascinating, because when the slaves came to the United States, there were many of them forcibly converted, given Christian names and so on. So religion became a big force for them. We've all heard about Negro spirituals, power of music. And Pentecostalism has been very, very strong with the Afro-American community. And so that explains why some Afro-Americans will support Trump. You know, you've got to understand this theology, this belief that we are the chosen. And this feeling that this place is the promised land. And so when Trump talks about make America great again, he's tapping into this powerful force that's been around for 400 years, that this place is the promised land, that they are the elect, and that everyone in the world should go along with it. And the emphasis on his sort of billionaire mates, very much central to Calvinist theology, the fact that if you love God, God will make you rich, which is central to Pentecostalism. And again, this obscure passage in the New Testament, that if you believe in Jesus, God will make you rich. I was brought up to believe it was the other way around. If you were lucky enough to be wealthy, you should give money away. I'm a follower of Peter Singer, the philosopher, who said, if you've got enough money to live on, give away 20% of your income. I think that's much more compatible with the message of Jesus in the New Testament. But no, central to Calvinism, central to Pentecostalism, central to the Trump administration, is this idea that God rewards you by making you wealthy. And that, as we all know, you've got this combination of emphasis on wealth and Make America Great Again. So much of it goes back to this theology that is so dominant with all the different groups. So it's not one group, all the different groups who've gone to the United States, often for religious reasons, as religious refugees. And this is where the conservative forces come in. It's quite fascinating. Some of you have lived in the United States, you may want to comment on it because I'll stop now, and express your opinions and views or challenge me on mine. But I find it really fascinating trying to understand what it is that makes the United States different. Yeah?
There's apparently a group or a trend of what's called Christian nationalism.
Oh, yes.
And individuals seem to, and this seems to be common in history, there's movies about it, the Gilman Gantry's famous movie about this kind of thing, where people just seem to set up their own religion. And they're usually quite egotistical, white males,
Yeah.
and they get money, and they have sex with their parishioners,
Yeah.
they'll do all kinds of really bad things. But it's very prominent, and that these Christian nationalists seem to have a really big influence.
I'm supervising a student at the Friends School at the moment who's doing her independent project on Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
So thank you for mentioning that. You're quite right. Again, it's not tied to any particular church, but it's a theology. Yeah. And you're quite right, because one of the things that always intrigued me is a lot of the leaders of these sort of churches, they say there's a new one in Los Angeles every day. They pop up, they're built around a charismatic preacher usually, and then they block their copybook, and then they repent. And God loves a repentant sinner. So that they get away with it. Thank you for mentioning that. Christian nationalism, really important. Yes. Oh, there's a lot I haven't mentioned, but they're progressive force. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I found out when I was doing my master's research here was Andrew Inglis Clark was a Unitarian, and they used to meet in a building down in Franklin Square. Yeah, but I preached at the Unitarian Church in Sydney. That was quite interesting, so I've met some of them. Yeah, there are a number of different churches. I touched on the better known ones. Thank you for mentioning the Unitarians. No. I'm a lousy writer. Yeah. Oh.
Tell us, is there a book that would help us understand?
There's lots of books and articles, but I can't think of one particular book. Yeah. A couple of people at the back, yeah?
I don't know if the USA does a census like we do in Australia. I was wondering what proportion of the USA would say that they don't believe in God.
It's a much smaller number than here. Yeah.
Are there any stats that you're
Well, there's a huge proportion of Americans go to church on a Sunday, far more than here, where it's dropping steadily. There probably are figures, but I haven't seen them. Yeah.
The problem I have with Pentecostals is that I understand that they really are progressing down into Central America with radio stations
Yep.
and evangelising down there and spreading their stuff.
We call it the electronic church, so it's just that technology is helping them spread the word. You're quite right. And they've made a lot of inroads into the Catholic Church in places like Brazil and the Philippines and so on. And again, you can understand the attraction that God helps those who help themselves, to people who are poor, and instead of sort of taking a more radical analysis, they sort of say, well, we can join in too.
But in the end, he doesn't stop typhoons and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff that destroyed us.
Well, this is part of their idea that God's punishing us because we're wicked, and Jesus is going to come back and save them and not the rest of us. So that sort of fits into that theology. Yeah. Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, again, it's the early settlers were religious refugees from Europe, and in small communities the church provided a community and a central body of support. I always think of what's that novel that all the kids have to study in high school, yeah, that's right. Thank you, Kill of a Mockingbird. That sort of gives you some idea of what it's like in the small town and in the deep south, the centrality of religion. And of course they all dislike the other groups. So the Presbyterians dislike the Baptists and the Methodists and Congregationalists. Yeah?
The theme that I'm an atheist. The theme I've got through this talk today is a cynical use of religion to get power. That's the way I'm seeing it. I think Trump probably could be the exponent of that. And it's just a shame that people are kind of sucked in by it, because from what I've observed is that the religion is, well, for a start, these religions that you've talked about are using obscure passages in the Bible to do mean things. What about the passages in the Bible where we're told to love our fellow man and all that kind of thing? It's almost, to me, it seems there are very good religious people, don't misunderstand me, but it seems a cynical act to use these passages to be really cruel, to have control, not just of women, but black people, the LGBTQI community. It's such hatred that goes against the sort of religion that I was in when I was at school, when we had religious studies and things.
Well, that's why I stressed it's really important to understand that there is, progressive faith in the United States. And I talked to you deliberately about the Catholic workers. I talked to you about the Mennonites. Somebody mentioned the Unitarians. These are all progressive forces. And at the moment, they're coming out very strongly against Trump, but we don't hear about them.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Don't hear about
Well, again, where the media kicks in. Yeah. Yeah.
It'd be interesting if, with all those groups in America, if Jesus Christ did come, not a single one of them would recognise him anyhow, would they?
There's a lot of good jokes about that. I think that, I can't remember it, but some of the ones I've seen are very funny. But I think, again, it comes back, biblical analysis I find fascinating. I said it sort of originated with the German schools back in the 18th century. This idea of Jesus coming back, what did it mean? One of the interesting things for me, when I was doing my research at uni about the failure of the radical movements in the 17th century, was the Quakers got locked up with the Fifth Monarchists. And the Fifth Monarchists again took their stuff, that there are 5 empires. And when the Roman Empire collapsed with 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, they ran through the streets of London shouting, "Come King Jesus." They thought it was going to drop down on them. So they got locked up by Cromwell with the Quakers. And they had a discussion about exactly what you were talking about. And the Quakers apparently took the line that Jesus isn't literally coming back. What we're enjoined to do is live those values, as opposed to the idea that Jesus is going to come back and clean the place up because we've stuffed it up. So there's a big polarization over this idea of what did Jesus mean if the text is correct, he'll come back. And we're still arguing about it. So a lot of these groups, as I said, say it's going to happen now in our lifetime. And if you ask them why the others are all wrong, they just say, "Oh, we're right and they were wrong." Yes?
I wonder how much effect Christianity has had on the indigenous people.
Quite a lot. Yeah.
It seems to me that religion, maybe all religions, are used as a convenient excuse for doing anything.
They can be. I mean, I argue that every faith, the centrality of the faith, I think it was the Dalai Lama who said, is compassion. But they go off in obscure, awful directions. Yeah. Okay. So it's a good thing we're not, was it all the different churches that banned tea and coffee?
Thank you, sir.